You know, an ongoing story is a great thing, as it can introduce people to a franchise one way or another. They allow for more people to come in and enjoy a series, and of course, it means money. Companies are allowed to make money and capitalize on the hype gained by new people who think that's enticing, and old fans who just want more of the world and characters. However, stories, even if they go on for a while if justified, should definitely have an ending. The journey should feel rewarding to have sat through or played it, something that Marvel doesn't understand. But the ending is supposed to make you feel that you've completed something, and in the case of a game, you've completed the journey of playing as its characters, and feel rewarded with that journey to the end. With that all being said, God of War Ragnarok is that ending. I know, I'm very great at segueing. It was long, it had proper ups and downs, and it ends with not just a bang, but a goddamn boom. There's a lot of stuff to say here, from the story to the combat, the artistry, so on. But this game is mostly a tight package. There were definitely a few issues and a few bumps on the road that can be easily fixed, and some just not very much so, along with general discussion points that I just want to get into. This video will be longer, but I'm sure it'll be perfectly fine. Well, let's go forth into the gameplay first, which will be the easiest to talk about. We'll start with combat. The combat in the first game was the thing that pretty much I and everyone else was scared about before the release of that game. It had surprised everyone once the game actually dropped. It wasn't deep, but the amount of moves, combinations, and generally flashy attacks surprised everyone back in 2018. There definitely were some issues with combat, like the camera would be a complete nuisance because it was way too close to Kratos back when attacking. But that wasn't really that much of a problem for me for the most part, but definitely did ruin the combat sometimes. Sadly, this isn't really fixed in Ragnarok, but it's a tad more zoomed out, very subtly. The verticality of the original games was also missed in 2018's God of War, and while that isn't completely fixed in the newest game, it definitely feels a little closer to the original game in a more subtle way. The worst part about combat, though, were boss fights and enemy variety. The enemies were mostly the same for most of the last game. For the most part, you fight these Draugr, Hellwalkers, and occasionally ogres. There were other enemy types, but they were very few and far between and didn't appear very often. It was fun to fight the Draugr, but after a while it just felt repetitive. Ragnarok pretty much fixes all of that by allowing more general enemy variety in the game, and making sure that there are as many distinct enemies as possible. Draugr, Hellwalkers, and ogres still exist, but they're used less, and also just look different and feel different, kind of. The other thing that Ragnarok improved upon were bosses. There were literally 5 good boss fights, and 2 of them were literally the same guys, so 4 bosses were generally good in the last game, and no, Valkyries don't count as their endgame content. The few good fights were Baldur, Magni and Modi, and Hraeslir the dragon, but these fights were very few and far between. The game would rather shove the 12th troll recolored with the same goddamn moveset, and if not fighting the trolls, you were fighting some goddamn rock monster. And yeah, that was it. The fights that were there that weren't the trolls were either non-existent or just boring. To make things worse, bosses weren't really challenging at times. Again, Valkyries don't count since they were endgame fights, and that didn't affect the story at all. Ragnarok doesn't have exactly challenging bosses for the most part, but they're at least fun to fight this time and have interesting movesets that are able to keep up with you. The fights don't have to be ludicrously difficult, but they're much improved from the last game's very monotonous boss fights. I wasn't a fan of the Phantoms though, and I thought they were kind of boring to fight. But overall, the fights for the most part they were fun. The overall difficulty on Give Me God of War was easier than the last game, but that was only because it wasn't as spongy and monotonous as that last one. The bosses were a nightmare on that, and they definitely would be a nightmare on this one too, if, it was just as spongy. The combat would be improved upon based on discussion points I'll talk about later, but I think that for what they could do, this was a fair improvement over the last game. I like the more vertical combat, even if it's not as fleshed out as I think it could have been. Another part of combat that I think is massively improved upon over the last game was the gore. The gore in the last game was a lot more tame than the originals. I get that Kratos is supposed to move on from the reveling violence and excess, but I just didn't feel like it was much God of War. Ragnarok doesn't go as far as God of War 1 through Ascension, but I do think it's a bit more intense than the last game. There are decapitations and more brutal kills in both cutscenes and gameplay. The last game definitely had gore, but it only pops up occasionally. I think that the gore made fights far more visceral in this one, and that extends to the finishers too. In the last game, finishers were only barehanded and not with weapons, and also not that brutal, so the lack of blood just didn't make it feel as great as it could have been. And while I'm disappointed that they removed the barehanded finishers, the ones in this game are far more gory than the last game, and it's only for the best. They aren't exactly as good as the other ones in the originals, but compared to 2018, they actually make you feel like the God of War and not just that buff guy that fights sometimes. There are also these new moves where you press triangle, and they're kinda nice if used strategically. Not much to say, but they're a cool addition, I guess. There is a new weapon that isn't Mjolnir like we all hoped, but if I'm being honest, that would be a bit fanfiction-esque in retrospect. We instead have the spear, which is pretty cool. It doesn't seem that impressive at first, but once you upgrade it, it's pretty fun to use. Not much to say about it, but I really liked it. They also slightly fixed the bad RPG mechanics of the last one, with that epic and legendary bullshit that they had in the last game. Now it's a bit more simple, and I actually want to upgrade my weapons and armor this time. It's not perfect because it feels a little tacked on, but it's definitely an improvement. Well, time to transition into the other part of the gameplay. Now we talk about Atreus. Yes, you can play as the boy in this one, and honestly, it's not terrible. I won't say it's nearly as good as the Kratos gameplay, but the combos can be just as good, kind of, in these sections at first. But the worst part of this game was the dream sequence, because that dragged on for nearly 2 hours of play. Yeah, unfortunately these sections are kind of padded out. I grew to hate these sections until the boss fight with Angerboda's grandmother or whatever, which is actually pretty decent. The missions are fine with combat, but can become mildly repetitive over time. You don't have the same variety as Kratos, and it makes the finishers take a hit too. It's fine for Atreus to not have the same brutality as Kratos, kinda like how Catwoman in Batman Arkham City didn't have as many gadgets as Batman did. Well, for the sake of superhero game comparison, Atreus sections are to the MJ Miles sections in Marvel Spider-Man than they would be to the Catwoman sections in Arkham City. Ragnarok goes from the PlayStation answer to Marvel Thor to going on autopilot as playing some edgy teenager. Narratively, I like these sections, but gameplay-wise, they're just kind of underwhelming. At least it's not most of the game, but these sections felt like kind of an afterthought. It would have been really good DLC if Sony were to basically rewrite and rework this game in terms of story. But for what's here, it's fine, I guess. The last thing for gameplay we're going to talk about is puzzles. The puzzles allow you to think and are generally fine, but the issues are with these annoying-ass puzzle hints that you just can't disable at all. Mimir, Atreus, or Freya will keep jabbering in your ear about certain hints because they don't want you to solve the puzzle by yourself, I guess, and it gets really annoying as all hell. The hints themselves aren't bad, but for all the accessibility options that they put in this game, it's weird that they didn't give you the option to just turn these hints off. It would have made the puzzles a hell of a lot less annoying if they actually just allowed you to just think about it, instead of just talking about it over and over and over again. But overall, in spite of some issues, the general gameplay, despite some rough patches, definitely is good and an improvement from 2018. Well, now to get into some of those controversial discussion points. first discussion point is the visuals. They don't look gigantically improved from the last game because this game is cross-generation, like Spider-Man Miles Morales or Horizon Forbidden West. But this game is definitely rooted in PS4 hardware and its rendering. But what matters is the artistry of play, and it looks great, especially Vanaheim and Svartalfheim, which looks so visually great. The worlds are so vibrant and distinct too. I completely understand how people were a bit underwhelmed with the rendering, however. I get that this doesn't look next-gen, but the developers made it very clear that this was very much rooted in PS4 hardware. And personally, I was a little disappointed too, but with the game actually out now, I actually like some of these additions, like 120 FPS support. Let's be real, that feature would not be a thing if it was an all-new game exclusively for the PS5. And if it was, it'd probably be some stupid-ass patch for the VRR thing. I think some people just needed to chill when they were talking about whether it was DLC versus being a sequel. And speaking of sequels, I might be eaten alive by the gaming community for this one. And I'm gonna ask the question, should this game have been split in two, or should it have been one colossal game? Now there is a logical explanation as to why there are only two games in the Norse saga. The reason is because game development is long and difficult, especially in recent years, and it has become more expensive to add to the general laborious task of even conceptualizing the game. I'm personally fine with it being two games, having played the game, but in a perfect world, I feel like the gameplay could have been improved had it been a trilogy, and not just a two-game saga. I'm glad with what we got, but there are still pretty glaring flaws in my opinion, that could have been improved on in a third game, maybe. In spite of all that though, I'm still fairly satisfied with what we got. Now we're gonna go into really controversial territory. We're gonna talk about the changes to its characters. We're gonna start off with Thor first, as the more prolifically controversial in terms of familiarity. Thor in this game is fat. Now personally, as someone who knew what Norse mythology is before watching Marvel movies or reading the comics, I was perfectly fine with this, because it was mythologically accurate. But other people, well, I guess their minds were ruined by the MCU.
What the hell is that? What is that? Seriously, Santa Monica, what is that? Is that supposed to be the thing that is going against Kratos? We literally, I think I said in my reaction during the reveal, like, yo, we getting like in-game Thor? Like, which type of Thor we getting? I didn't literally mean we getting.
Because they expected goddamn Chris Hemsworth. Man, if only people did their research. Thor is literally a Viking god, and the thing about Vikings is that, unlike a lot of the idealized warrior archetypes that you see nowadays, these guys were definitely overweight in terms of build. Literally, their lives were just indulgence. Their lives devolved into eat, drink, kill, have sex, sleep, repeat. They didn't really have complicated lives, if you really think about it, and they weren't buff warriors either. The Viking lifestyle plays into Thor's arc, which we'll get into later, but the point is that it was such a dumb thing to get mad about. Thor is still really tall and imposing in the game, so who really cares if he doesn't have the Chris Hemsworth body type? Now for the most controversial part. Angrboda. Angrboda hasn't really been introduced into the MCU or anything yet. Not that that really matters, because they're Norse mythology things and they weren't originated from Marvel. But for some reason, people were mad that she was a black girl.
I can't believe that still, till this day, I'm receiving stupid, dumb, woke-tarded comments on my God of War Ragnarok Angrboda video /short on how Angrboda, she should not be black, she will never be black, and she should not be depicted as such, man. But hey, I'm not a Norse mythological expert here. Make some noise! But the information is out there on how Angrboda should have greenish, bluish skin. Heck! There's even depictions of her being white, a white ginger, because newsflash! Norse mythology was made by white people.
Okay. I mean, like, I get that it's inaccurate, but this entire series is fucking inaccurate. Which is really weird, because people got mad at Thor's mythologically accurate design. But whatever. By these logical fallacies, Kratos shouldn't even exist at all, since Kratos was based on a Greek god. But that Greek god did not kill Ares to become the god of war. He definitely should not have had Atreus, who was revealed as Loki in the last game, since Loki didn't have the blood of a Greek god. And, you know, the main dwarves, Sindri and Brock, don't have the same names as they originally did. And also, Mimir's fucking Scottish.
You gave us quite a scare there.
Glad to see you too, Mimir.
Let that sit in for a bit. Yeah, I'm waiting. Point being, that this series is not exactly mythologically accurate to Greek or Norse mythology. For the most part, Angrboda's controversy was definitely rooted in some bigotry. Not saying everything should be inaccurate to the source material, but some differences are incredibly ineffectual. Just play the game, damn it! Anyway, now with all the nonsensical controversy out the way, we're gonna actually talk about the story in this game. There will be quite a few spoilers, but this video is not gonna be like some new Rockstar's breakdown that's supposed to analyze how something's comic accurate to some setup or anything. However, I will give a general overview and synopsis of the plot, and talk briefly about some moments I liked in the story. So without further ado, go forth into Ragnarok. You've been warned for spoilers. The story picks up 3 years after the 2018 game, after they spread Faye's ashes across Jotunheim, and after they killed Baldur, the son of Freya, which starts Fimbulwinter, along with the fact that it's been 3 years since Kratos and Atreus found the mural that stated Atreus is Loki, which makes Atreus very curious about his role in Ragnarok. However, Kratos does not want to go to war during Ragnarok, or even be involved in the first place, so he insists that Atreus is better at home. But, unfortunately, Kratos' bubbles burst, and Thor along with Odin drop by the home in a very violent fashion, offering Kratos a choice for peace, and Atreus is told not to look for Tyr, who is the god of war of the Norseland. However, Kratos says no, since he already understands that Odin is a very manipulative fellow, and his promises ultimately mean nothing to him. This triggers the fight with Thor, which is a really great fight. Won't get too much in detail about the fights narratively, but afterwards Thor flies away. Kratos returns home in fear that Odin took Atreus, which doesn't happen. Kratos then gets mad about Atreus' search for Tyr, but eventually allows Atreus to search anyways, I guess. They then find a new home in Sindri's house, and go off into Svartalfheim. Missions later, we find Tyr, and the journey truly kicks off from here. However, after seeing that prophecy about a champion, which Kratos doesn't like, Atreus then accidentally dreams of himself into Jotunheim, and meets Angrboda, yeah, the one that we had controversy about earlier, who is one of the few living giants there. After the dream sequence, he talks into a stone and says home, but accidentally ends up in Midgard, which pretty much is run by Helmwalkers at this point. He then takes the Mystic Gateway, and Kratos shows up to reveal that he was gone for 2 days. Atreus was promised to not tell Kratos for what he saw in the prophecy on the mural in Jotunheim, so Kratos gets reasonably frustrated. Then a Valkyrie shows up and it turns out to be Freya, who still wants vengeance. After that, they call a brief truce to get her freedom back, to travel across the 9 realms, and send Atreus back to Sindri's house. To get Freya's freedom back, they had to go to Vanaheim and pull on some roots that are controlled by this thing called a Needhog. They then get her freedom back, but Freya decides to not kill or forgive Freya, making their truce permanent. They then return to Sindri's house to ask where Atreus was. Kratos assumes that he was in Asgard, to which Atreus says no, but he rhetorically asks, what if he did? Atreus then rampages and inevitably goes to Asgard anyways. However, much later, he unleashes a terrible, tearing of realms wolf named Garm, and comes back to Kratos after his failure. From then, they forge a plan to stop Odin. By the end of the game, they kill Odin, and Atreus and Kratos part ways. Atreus looks for possible living giants, and Kratos begins to rebuild realms after Ragnarok. As you can tell from this fairly long-winded synopsis, this is a very long game. The story should take about 20 hours to beat, mainly in gameplay, and you can feel it. I feel like sometimes the pacing in this game is definitely dragging, and it would have definitely been better if it was really 3 games in terms of evening the pacing out. But with that aside, I definitely loved this story. Just like the last game, the game is carried by Kratos and Atreus' relationship. The relationship's a lot different this time, since Kratos already learned to become a father in that last game. But the difference is that there are some cracks in this lesson too. Kratos is overprotective because of that, and he doesn't want to let his son go in any way. And he learns that holding onto his son too tightly can really drive them further apart, as it actually does. Now yes, this will sound very, very familiar to something like Finding Nemo or some shit, but it's definitely just as nuanced and mature as that one. If not, way more, because that's a fucking G-rated movie. Kratos has to learn that holding onto his kid too tightly will separate them, and being more protective isn't always that healthy. The game doesn't just demonize Kratos and side with Atreus either. It allows Atreus to learn that straying too far can just ruin the relationship in general, and resistance is definitely not always the best thing, especially towards your parents. The other characters are really great too. The dwarves are actually a lot better in this one, hilariously enough. I liked them in the last one as I thought they were funny for the most part, but these ones actually have more depth now, for some reason. Well, probably because it's Ragnarok, who cares? And there's a twist that apparently Sindri pulled Brock's fucking soul out of Alfheim, and it was actually a pretty fun twist. And Brock finds out later, after, well, trying to talk to someone, I guess. And then after that, it just kind of put the wedge in their brotherhood a little bit. But then when Brock actually dies, Sindri just learns to let go. But it doesn't always affect him positively either, as they were tricked by Odin into thinking that Tyr was actually still there, but it was just Odin the whole time, who stabs Brock in the first place. And of course, Sindri has the right to be mad about this one. And I actually like that Sindri never really forgives Atreus, even though it was all an accident. He never actually comes to terms with it, and even when they try to approach him, he never is like, well, you know what, I forgive you guys, because that would be too cheesy and dumb. Speaking of the Asgardian characters, I think Odin is a genuinely great villain. He's manipulative in a way that, even though it's established that he lies and manipulates, he always wants to find answers, and he'll basically just kill anyone that's in his way, including his own kin. Speaking of kin, let's talk about Thor. Thor is a genuinely great character. I was afraid of how they'd handle him because I thought he would just be the cool boss to punch in the face and nothing more, but he has a surprising amount of depth. The Viking lifestyle, as mentioned earlier, comes into play when Odin views him as only that. Odin just thinks Thor is a dumb, brainless, drunk killing machine that only exists to destroy people on lands. But then Kratos allows himself to tell Thor that destroying isn't always who he is, and it doesn't have to be exactly who he is. And so, he retaliates against Odin. Even though Odin kills him, you can definitely tell that Thor from that one moment alone had grown a lot as a character. And again, Odin will literally kill anyone just so he can find answers. I also like his ex-wife Freya. He doesn't kill or forgive Kratos as a resolution for, us killing Baldur. But it's definitely more realistic to have it happen that way. Because forgiving for something like that is a very hard thing to do. Especially considering that, it's your fucking son murdered? Because if it was done any other way, it would have been cheesy and safe. Also, the dream sequences with Kratos and Faye are genuinely good, even if they're essentially just prequel cutscenes. It allows us to see us just get more depth from Kratos. They're very brief scenes, but damn, they're really impactful. These characters are fully realized for the most part, and I like how Fimbulwinter and Ragnarok affect them differently. It makes the universe just feel real and fleshed out. The ending of the story feels really earned because Kratos realizes that he should allow Atreus to become his own man since he's growing up. The music, the shot composition, everything works in this scene. It's genuinely just beautiful to watch, and just like the last game and how it makes you feel like you've come so far on this journey, It actually allows you to leave the journey, somewhat sad, but you kind of look forward to the rest of it. In conclusion, God of War Ragnarok is an amazing game. The end of an era. I don't care if this wins Game of the Year or not, but this game was definitely a very masterfully crafted story by Sony and Santa Monica Studios. There are definitely some rough patches here and there, but overall this game has improved gameplay, great art, great storytelling, and it has the heart from the last game, if not more. There are definitely some gameplay issues here and there. Sometimes the story can feel a little uneven, but hey, Ragnarok was definitely a very fun journey to venture through. It may be the end of the Norse tale, but the series will always stick with the players.
Think of our children. We must be better. Get ready.